The summer of 1992 in Wichita, Kansas, was golden and endless. The wheat fields swayed under the hot August sun, and cicadas hummed in the distance. It was the kind of summer where teenagers stayed out past sunset, laughter drifting over quiet urban streets. For Angela Angie Whitmore, 19 years old, this was supposed to be a summer of beginnings. Who Angie was? Angie was the youngest of three sisters, the one with the camera always slung around her neck. She loved taking candid shots, her friends mid-laugh, her father tinkering with his old Ford truck, her mother baking cinnamon rolls in the kitchen. She worked part-time at the local diner, saving up for community college classes in the fall. Her dream was to study journalism, to tell real stories about real people, something her older sister teased her about, calling her the small-town Barbara Walters. Everyone who knew her described her the same way. Bright smile. Quick laugh. Fierce loyalty. Her boyfriend, Daniel Cross, said Angie had this way of making you feel like you mattered, even if you didn't matter to anyone else. The last summer. That August, Angie spent most of her free time with friends, floating down the Arkansas River or watching movies in the small theater on Main Street. She was planning a trip to Kansas City with her best friend, Heather Mills, to see a live concert, her first real adventure away from home. Her family remembers her buzzing with excitement that week. No one could have known that the same week she was picking out concert outfits, someone else in town had begun watching her, waiting. Life forever changed. On the evening of August 14th, Angie kissed her mom goodbye and told her she'd be back before curfew. She never made it home. By dawn, the Whitmore household was unrecognizable, once filled with warm smells and chatter, now heavy with silence and unanswered questions. Her disappearance didn't just shatter her family. It rippled through the entire community. Teachers, church members, classmates, everyone felt the absence like a phantom limb. The small Kansas town had lost its innocence overnight. But the story of what happened to Angela Whitmore wouldn't be told in full until decades later, after years of pain, dead ends, and a shocking revelation that no one saw coming. Crime discovery. The search for Angie began before the sun was even up. By 5:30 a.m., neighbors with coffee mugs in hand were combing sidewalks and ditches. Her father drove the back roads, his headlights cutting through the fog, calling her name into the empty air. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone felt it. Something was wrong. The first lead. A jogger out for an early run noticed a strange sight near the outskirts of town. Angie's purse, lying at the edge of a gravel road, its contents scattered in the dust. The driver's license was inside, along with a cracked lipstick tube and a few crumpled dollar bills. Her camera was gone. By 9 a.m., sheriff's deputies had cordoned off the area. Tire tracks led away from the scene, but they were muddled by the comings and goings of search volunteers. A grim discovery. 2 days later, a farmer working his fields west of town saw something out of place in the tall grass near a windbreak. When he got closer, he froze. The Wichita County Sheriff's Office arrived minutes later. There, in the shade of cottonwood trees, they found Angie's body. Cause of death. The coroner's report would later reveal she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head and signs of strangulation. There were no defensive wounds on her arms, something investigators found chilling. It suggested she may have known her attacker. Community in shock. By that evening, the news had spread across every kitchen table and church pew in Wichita County. A memorial of flowers and photographs began to grow at the diner where Angie had worked. Her co-workers put her name on the specials board in bright pink chalk. It stayed there for months. The investigation begins. With no witnesses, no clear motive, and the small-town police force unprepared for a homicide investigation, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, KBI, was called in. They started with the obvious. Boyfriend Daniel Cross, who had been at a friend's house that night. Best friend Heather Mills, who last saw her leaving the movie theater. And a handful of regulars from the diner who had shown her unusual attention. The list was short, but each name carried its own shadows. The search for her killer was now a race against time. And somewhere in Wichita County, a murderer was walking free. Early investigation and first suspects. The KBI arrived in a convoy of unmarked sedans, their antennas whipping in the wind. They set up a temporary command post in the old army building, maps pinned to the walls, phones ringing constantly, evidence bags piling on folding tables. The small-town gossip mill had already turned into a roaring engine. Everyone had a theory. And in a town where everyone knows everyone, suspicion was like wildfire, jumping from house to house with no warning. First name on the list, Daniel Cross. Daniel was Angie's on-again, off-again boyfriend. When deputies first spoke to him, he said he'd been at his friend Greg's place all night, watching football, drinking beer. But when investigators talked to Greg, his story wasn't quite as airtight. Greg admitted Daniel left for about an hour around midnight. Daniel claimed he'd just gone for a drive to clear his head after an argument with Angie earlier that day. When asked what the argument was about, he wouldn't say. The best friend's story. Heather Mills, Angie's closest friend, told investigators she'd dropped Angie off at the movie theater that Friday night to meet someone. Heather assumed it was Daniel, until she learned he claimed not to have seen Angie that evening. Heather swore she didn't know who else Angie could have been meeting. But in a later interview, a different detail slipped. Angie had been really excited about a photography project and mentioned a new subject she'd been working with. Who that was, she never said. The diner regulars. The investigators also learned Angie had a habit of taking photos of the regular customers at Murphy's Diner, her side project for a photography contest. Most customers didn't mind. But one name kept coming up, Charles Chuck Delaney, a 42-year-old truck driver who had taken an unusual interest in Angie. Co-workers said he lingered long after finishing his meals and sometimes left notes or small gifts for her, behavior Angie shrugged off as harmless. When deputies questioned Chuck, he claimed he'd been hauling freight to Oklahoma the night she disappeared. But his logbook had several gaps in the recorded times. A chilling pattern emerges. The KBI noticed something that made the case even more urgent. 2 other unsolved murders in rural Kansas over the past 3 years had eerie similarities: young women, rural outskirts, signs of strangulation, and missing personal items. The possibility they were dealing with a serial offender couldn't be ignored. The case was no longer about just one small-town murder. It was about finding a predator before he struck again. The man they never suspected. The name that surfaced next didn't match anyone on the sheriff's list of known troublemakers. It wasn't a drifter. It wasn't a violent ex. It wasn't even someone who had ever been interviewed. It was Michael Warren. A quiet, well-liked man in his early 30s back in 1978. He worked at the local hardware store. Lived 2 blocks from the diner where the victim had her last meal. No criminal record. No gossip. No reason to suspect him. Until now. The sheriff's office pulled his old employment records, bank statements, and even property deeds. That's when they found something unsettling. On the day of the murder, Michael's time card showed him leaving work 3 hours early. No one had ever questioned it. No one had noticed, except now. Detectives tracked down surviving friends and co-workers. One remembered him being off that week. Another recalled he suddenly stopped coming to church after the murder, no explanation given. When officers knocked on his door in 2023, Michael was 77 years old. Still living in the same small town. Still keeping to himself. And still, by the look on his face, holding on to a secret he never thought would see daylight. The knock at his door. August 14, 2023. The late summer heat clung to the air like it was trying to suffocate the town. Detectives Ramirez and Hill stood on Michael Warren's front porch. Paint peeling. Curtains drawn. A single rusted wind chime clinking in the breeze. Michael answered in a faded plaid shirt, his hair a thin halo of white. For a moment, he just stared, like he was trying to calculate whether this was a dream or a nightmare. "Mr. Warren, we need to ask you some questions about an incident in 1978, Hill said. He didn't invite them in. Instead, he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. That small detail didn't go unnoticed, because it's what people do when they don't want you to see something. They started with soft questions, where he'd been that day, if he knew the victim. He denied everything. But when they mentioned DNA evidence, his hands began to tremble. Not visibly, just enough that the trained eyes of 2 seasoned detectives caught it. Then came the turning point. They told him they'd matched his genetic profile to evidence from the victim's clothing. That his name had surfaced because a distant relative uploaded their DNA to an ancestry site. For the first time, Michael spoke in a low, almost pleading voice. "That's not possible unless," he stopped himself. Swallowed hard. Looked at the ground. Ramirez leaned in. "Unless what, Michael?" He looked up, and his next words froze both detectives. "It wasn't me you should be looking for, it's her. Her name." The air between them thickened. Detective Ramirez's jaw tightened. Hill pulled out her notebook. "Who's her?" Ramirez asked. Michael shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Glanced at the closed front door, as if afraid it might open. Then he whispered a name neither detective had expected. "Margaret." Hill frowned. "Your wife." "My late wife," he corrected, his voice almost trembling. "She passed in '99. But, she wasn't the woman people thought she was." He said Margaret had a temper. That sometimes, when she felt wronged, she'd make sure people paid for it. But he swore he never thought she'd be capable of murder, until the day the police came knocking in 1978. She was gone for hours that night, he said. When she came home, her hands were shaking. She went straight to the shower. Ramirez studied his face. Why didn't you tell investigators back then? Michael's lips pressed into a tight line. Because she was pregnant, and I was a coward. Inside, something moved. A faint shadow behind the curtain. Hill shot Ramirez a look. He mouthed the words, "Someone's in the house." And that's when the front door creaked open, revealing a pair of eyes peering from the darkness inside. The shadow in the house. Ramirez's hand instinctively dropped to the grip of his sidearm. Hill's pulse kicked up. The figure in the doorway didn't move, just watched. "Sir, is someone else here with you?" Hill asked. Michael's voice wavered. That's my niece, Claire. She stays with me sometimes." But the figure didn't look like a young woman. Too tall. Too still. And those eyes, they weren't the eyes of someone casually standing in their own home. Ramirez took a slow step forward. "Claire, why don't you come into the light?" Silence. Then, the door shut. Hard. Hill moved fast, pushing past Michael, her voice sharp. "Police. Open the door." They burst inside. The living room was empty, but the back door hung wide open, swaying in the wind. Ramirez sprinted into the yard, scanning the tree line. Nothing. When he came back in, Hill was standing in the middle of the room, staring at an old, dust-covered photo frame on the mantel. It was Margaret. But not the Margaret from the obituary photo they'd seen in the file. In this picture, she was younger. Smiling. And standing beside her was the same person who'd just been watching them from the doorway. The face from the past. Hill's voice was barely above a whisper. "Ramirez, that's the same face from the window." Ramirez stared at the photograph, his mind already pulling threads together. The man in the picture had the same piercing eyes, the same angular jawline, only younger, cleaner, alive with confidence instead of that cold stillness. The brass nameplate at the bottom of the frame read, "Jonathan Price, 1982. Ramirez's stomach tightened. Jonathan Price wasn't just anybody. He was a suspect from the original 1989 case, a suspect who had vanished before police could bring him in for questioning. Hill looked at Michael. "You said that was your niece." Michael's lips trembled. I didn't know who he really was." Ramirez took a step closer. "You've been living with a fugitive for 35 years. Michael's eyes darted to the floor. He said they got it wrong back then. That Margaret begged him to hide after the cops came looking. I owed her. She raised me after my parents died." Hill's voice hardened. "Where is he now?" Michael's answer was swallowed by the sound of gravel crunching outside. A car engine idled, faint through the thin walls. Ramirez and Hill exchanged a quick look, then moved to the front window. A black sedan sat at the curb. Driver's seat empty. Passenger door open. And the figure, Jonathan Price, was walking straight toward the woods, a worn leather satchel in his hand. The woods remember. Ramirez didn't wait. "Go," he barked, already shoving the door open. Hill was right behind him, boots pounding the gravel driveway. The air was heavy, humid, and each breath felt like pulling steam into their lungs. Ahead, Jonathan Price didn't run like a man his age should. He moved fast, cutting into the trees with a precision that came from knowing these woods too well. The satchel bounced against his side. "Price! Stop!" Ramirez shouted, but his voice only scattered a few startled birds from the tree line. Branches slapped their faces as they plunged into the forest. Hill kept her eyes locked on the fleeting blur of Price's shirt between the pines. "You recognize this path?" she called. Ramirez nodded grimly. It was the same trail deputies had searched in 1989. The same trail where Margaret's body had been found. Price suddenly veered left, disappearing into a narrow gully. Ramirez slid down after him, mud pulling at his boots. When he looked up, Price was gone. Hill scanned the shadows. Then, faintly, came the sound of metal clinking against metal. They followed it to a half-collapsed hunting cabin. The door hung off its hinges. Inside, the smell of damp wood and old gasoline was almost choking. On the floor sat the satchel, open, stacks of yellowed newspaper clippings spilling out. Every headline was about Margaret's murder. But it wasn't the clippings that stopped Ramirez cold. It was the small revolver, wrapped in a blood-stained handkerchief, and a sheriff's badge from 1989. The arrest. By the end of the summer of 1989, tension in the small Florida town was like a thunderstorm waiting to break. The investigation had gone from quiet whispers to a full-on storm of suspicion, rumors, and fear. Detectives had spent months quietly watching, gathering every scrap of evidence. They didn't just want an arrest, they wanted a conviction that would stick. Surveillance teams documented movements, conversations, and even subtle interactions between people who swore they didn't know each other. Then came the break. A single, overlooked witness stepped forward. Their testimony, though brief, cracked open the final layer of secrecy. On a sweltering August afternoon, unmarked cars surrounded a modest single-story home. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as officers, armed with a warrant, moved in. The suspect, calm at first, was quickly handcuffed, the quiet click of metal echoing in the thick summer air. Reporters swarmed the street within minutes. Microphones and cameras pressed forward, catching the exact moment the accused was led away. Their face was expressionless, but their eyes burned with something no one could quite read. Was it guilt or defiance? For the families of the victims, it was a moment they had waited for years to see. For the town, it was the confirmation that the monster had been hiding in plain sight. But the real shock? The arrest wasn't the end of the story. Because what the police found inside that house would change everything. It was just after 6 a.m. when the quiet hum of Meadowbrook's morning was shattered. Police cruisers rolled down Maple Avenue, their lights cutting through the early fog. Neighbors peered through blinds as unmarked cars pulled into the driveway of a tidy, white two-story house. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the porch decorated with potted flowers, the kind of home you'd never expect to become the center of a decades-old murder investigation. Inside, the suspect had been awake for hours, pacing. Maybe they knew this day was coming. Maybe they'd spent the past 36 years waiting for the knock at the door. When detectives entered, the arrest was swift, no yelling, no struggle. Just a quiet exchange of handcuffs and rights read aloud. But it wasn't just the arrest that stunned Meadowbrook. It was who they arrested. This wasn't some shadowy figure hiding in the woods. This was someone who had lived among them for decades, a trusted face at the local store, a familiar voice at community meetings. Someone who had shaken hands with the very detectives now leading them away. The media descended instantly. Satellite vans clogged the street. Reporters shoved microphones at anyone willing to talk. Some neighbors refused to believe it. Others whispered, "I always knew something was off." And just like that, the town's perfect facade cracked wide open. What investigators had uncovered in the weeks leading up to this moment wasn't just enough to make an arrest, it was enough to blow the case wide open. Because buried inside the evidence was a secret no one in Meadowbrook had ever imagined. A secret that made this case not just about murder, but about betrayal on the deepest level. 4 days, the evidence had been mounting. The threads of the case wove a pattern too intricate to ignore. But the real breakthrough came not from forensics, not from witnesses, but from the suspect themselves. Detective Ramirez sat across from them in the interview room. The light above buzzed faintly, the only sound between them. "I've been protecting someone," the suspect finally said, voice low. "But it's not who you think." Ramirez leaned forward. "Who?" They hesitated, then whispered a name. A name that instantly shifted the entire case into a different light. The truth was more tangled, more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And suddenly, the hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. The courtroom was already tense when the judge called for the next witness. Everyone expected another predictable piece of testimony. No one expected the next 5 minutes to blow the entire case wide open. A man in his mid-40s walked in, confident stride, sharp suit, eyes scanning the room as if measuring everyone present. He introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Llewellyn, a forensic DNA specialist. His credentials were impeccable. But what he carried in his briefcase was what mattered. The prosecution had spent weeks insisting they had a full genetic match linking the defendant to the crime scene. It was the nail they wanted to hammer the coffin shut with. But when Dr. Llewellyn took the stand, he slid a thick folder across to the clerk and calmly began explaining his findings. The DNA profile used in this case, he said, was based on a mixture sample from multiple individuals. The state's lab misread the minor alleles. When retested at an independent facility, the defendant's genetic markers were not a match. The gallery gasped. The jurors stiffened. The prosecutor's jaw twitched. But Llewellyn wasn't done. In fact, he continued, the profile is an exact match to another individual, someone who was never tested in connection with this case until last week. He looked directly toward the prosecution table. His eyes locked on a man sitting quietly in the second row, someone no one had noticed before. That person, Llewellyn said, is sitting right here in this courtroom. Whispers rippled through the audience like a rising storm. The man in the second row froze, his face draining of color. The defense attorney's pen rolled off the table. And in the back of the room, a single click of a ballpoint pen cut through the silence. Detective Ramirez, taking furious notes. Whatever this case had been before, it wasn't that anymore. The judge's gavel slammed down, but it was too late. The revelation had changed everything. The courtroom was packed to the brim on the first day of the trial. Reporters filled the front row, their cameras aimed at the defendant's table. The hum of whispered speculation died the moment the judge entered. The prosecution wasted no time setting the tone. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the state attorney began, pacing deliberately, "this is not a story of misunderstanding. This is a story of calculation and cold-blooded murder." They called their first witness, Detective Alejandro Ramirez. His testimony was crisp and unshakable. He walked the jury through the crime scene photos, the forensic evidence, and the painstaking timeline investigators built. When the defense tried to rattle him during cross-examination, asking if there was any chance of contamination at the scene, Ramirez's voice stayed steady. "No. The evidence was secured the moment we arrived. Nothing about this case is circumstantial." Next came the emotional gut punch. Family members of the victim. Tyrese Brown, still visibly shaken, took the stand. He locked eyes with the defendant only once, then turned to the jury. "She was my whole world," his voice cracked. "You don't just lose a person like that. You lose the future you were building." The prosecution let the silence linger, every juror's gaze fixed on the grief in his face. Then came the defense's turn. They painted their client as a victim of circumstance, manipulated, misunderstood, and wrongfully accused. They called witnesses who claimed the accused was gentle and incapable of violence. They pressed on inconsistencies in early police interviews, trying to seed doubt. The trial's most tense moment came when the prosecution cross-examined the defendant. "You say you didn't know the victim," the attorney leaned in, voice low. "Yet your fingerprints were found inside her car. How do you explain that?" The defendant's jaw tightened. "I can't. I don't know how they got there." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Closing arguments hit like a sledgehammer. The state painted a picture of opportunity, motive, and irrefutable evidence. The defense clung to the thread of reasonable doubt. When the jury returned after just 6 hours, the room was silent except for the sound of the foreperson standing. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Gasps. Tears. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The victim's family clung to each other, relief and sorrow tangled together. At the defense table, the convicted killer stared straight ahead. No emotion, no reaction. The trial was over. But for those who had lived this nightmare, justice was just the beginning of healing.